My name is Summer. I'm 32 years old, and until recently, I was a senior compliance analyst at a mid-sized infrastructure firm in Seattle. Remember birthdays. In meetings, I remember birthdays. In meetings, I'm usually the one adjusting the projector or circulating the summary email afterward. I've been told more than once that I have a steady presence. It's meant as a compliment. But steady in corporate language often translates to invisible. I've always had a face that people talk past rather than to, a voice that blends into the room. At work, that meant I was trusted with details but rarely with decisions. I was reliable but not influential, safe but not powerful. The kind of person executives would thank in the hallway and forget in the boardroom. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about dramatic confrontations or public humiliation. There are no screaming matches, no glasses shattered against conference room walls. It's about something quieter. It's about a sleepless night at the office, one that changed the direction of my life without anyone realizing it at the time. It's about the moment I understood that silence can either bury you or protect you. And it's about the night I copied the corruption files, every contract, every off-book transfer, every internal memo that wasn't meant to survive daylight. I didn't hack anything. I didn't break into locked drawers. I simply did what I had always done. I paid attention. And when I realized what I was looking at, I made a choice, a careful one. Over the next few months, the director everyone admired, the one who dominated meetings, who was always 2 steps ahead, began to lose ground in ways he couldn't explain. Budgets stalled. Audits appeared. Questions surfaced from places he never expected. He never once suspected me. This isn't a story about taking someone down. It's about what happens when a person everyone underestimates decides to stop being careless with her own quiet. If you've ever been the one people assume will stay small, have you ever wondered what would happen if you didn't? At Whitaker and Rowe Infrastructure, I was known as the steady one. Not brilliant, not ambitious, not threatening. Steady. If someone needed a 200-page vendor compliance file reviewed overnight, they gave it to me. If a board packet had to be assembled with color-coded tabs and footnotes cross-referenced, it landed on my desk. If the director needed someone to quietly confirm that a contract amendment wouldn't trigger regulatory attention, I was the one who would take a look. I was rarely in the room when strategies were born, but I was always in the room when documentation was cleaned. There's a particular kind of invisibility that looks like competence. You are trusted, but only with tasks that support someone else's spotlight. I had mastered that space. I spoke when spoken to. I kept my tone neutral. I learned to condense complex regulatory language into 2-sentence summaries executives could digest between sips of sparkling water. People thanked me often. They just never considered me consequential. Our director, Daniel Harrow, embodied the opposite of invisibility. Early 40s, polished, the kind of man who never loosened his tie even at 8 p.m. He had a voice that filled a room without rising. Investors loved him. The board admired his decisiveness. He was known for moving fast. Speed in infrastructure development is seductive and dangerous. Daniel liked having me nearby, not beside him, but behind him. I was efficient, discreet, predictable. When he asked for confirmation that something was within tolerance, I would respond with carefully chosen language. It does not appear to raise immediate compliance concerns. Immediate. That word mattered, but no one ever asked why I used it. In meetings, Daniel sometimes summarized my reports without credit. Compliance has reviewed it, he would say, gesturing vaguely in my direction. Heads would nod, pens would move, decisions would lock into place. I told myself it didn't matter. My job wasn't recognition, it was risk management. And yet, I noticed patterns. When I raised cautious questions, they were reframed as logistical hurdles. When I flagged inconsistencies, they were categorized as timing issues. When I suggested waiting for additional documentation, the room would grow subtly impatient. I learned to measure the temperature of a boardroom by the rhythm of breathing. The truth is, I had trained myself to be palatable. Growing up, being easy kept conflict away. At work, it kept me employed. I understood hierarchy, I understood power dynamics, and I understood that quiet women are often mistaken for compliant ones. So I let them believe it. I organized files others skimmed. I memorized clauses others signed without reading. I noticed when dates didn't align, when invoices were rounded too conveniently, when subsidiary accounts moved funds in patterns that looked symmetrical. But noticing is not the same as acting. At that time, I still believed that if something was truly wrong, someone louder than me would catch it. That was who I was to them, the reliable one, the background presence, the woman who would stay late without complaint and leave before applause. They never once asked what I was thinking while I was taking notes, and that was their first mistake. The first time Daniel corrected me in a way that wasn't really a correction, it happened so smoothly that no one else registered it. We were reviewing a land acquisition deal in Tacoma, an industrial parcel that had been sitting undeveloped for years. On paper, it was clean. Environmental clearance had been granted, zoning adjustments were pending but expected to pass. The numbers projected strong returns within 18 months. But something about the payment schedule felt off. The vendor agreement included a consulting fee routed through a third-party advisory firm I hadn't seen before. The fee wasn't outrageous, just large enough to matter and small enough not to alarm anyone glancing at totals. I flagged it gently during the internal pre-meeting. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice even, "there's a consulting disbursement tied to Phase 2. The advisory firm was incorporated 3 months ago. I'd recommend additional verification before final approval." He didn't look at this document. He looked at me, and he smiled. "Summer," he said lightly, "that's already been vetted. It's a timing vehicle, standard structuring, nothing to worry about." Nothing to worry about? It was the tone, not the words. Around the table, shoulders relaxed. Someone made a note. The conversation moved forward as if my comment had been an overcautious footnote. I felt the shift immediately, the subtle recalibration of how my concern was categorized. Not incorrect, just unnecessary. After the meeting, I returned to my desk and reopened the file. I reviewed the advisory firm's registration again. A mailbox address, no operating history. Directors listed through a formation service. Technically permissible. Structurally plausible. But think. That evening, I drafted a short follow-up memo outlining the verification gaps. I chose careful language. No accusations, just procedural clarity. Daniel replied 2 hours later. "Appreciate the thoroughness. We'll proceed as planned. Please archive your notes for record keeping." Archive your notes. That was the first small cut. It wasn't humiliation. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't belittle me publicly. In fact, from the outside, he looked supportive, grateful for diligence. But he had overridden my professional judgment without review. And more importantly, he had done it with confidence that I would accept the dismissal quietly. I told myself it wasn't personal. Directors make executive decisions all the time. Risk tolerance varies. My role was advisory, not decisive. Still, something lingered. A week later, the consulting fee cleared. The third-party firm transferred funds again within 48 hours to a holding account I didn't immediately recognize. The trail ended in a layered ownership structure that would take effort to untangle, an effort that no one had asked for. In the break room, I overheard 2 managers praising Daniel's efficiency. "He doesn't get bogged down in red tape," one said. "He knows when to push through." Push through. I stood there stirring my tea, thinking about that phrase. Red tape is what people call safeguards when they're in a hurry. I considered escalating the concern. Not formally, just a conversation with internal audit. But the documentation didn't cross a clear violation threshold. It was ambiguous. And ambiguity in corporate culture favors momentum. So I did what I had always done. I documented everything. I saved time-stamped copies of the original agreements. I exported transaction confirmations. I stored my memo and Daniel's response in a labeled subfolder within the compliance archive. Not because I planned to use them, but because something in me had shifted from passive trust to quiet attention. That first small cut didn't bleed. It barely left a mark. But it changed the way I listened in meetings. It changed the way I read emails. It changed the way I interpreted Daniel's easy confidence. For the first time, I wasn't just supporting the system, I was watching it, and they still believed I was simply taking notes. After the Tacoma deal, nothing exploded. No investigations, no whistleblower emails, no headlines. Just growth. Revenue climbed. Project timelines accelerated. Daniel's reputation inside the firm sharpened into something close to myth. He was the director who made things happen. The board quoted him. Junior managers tried to mimic his phrasing. And I adjusted. The second time he overrode me, it was even smoother. A subcontractor agreement came across my desk with revised payment milestones. The adjustment shifted a significant percentage of compensation to an upfront disbursement, unusual for the scale of deliverables promised. I highlighted the variance in a written summary and suggested tying the release to performance verification. During the review meeting, Daniel nodded as I spoke. "Valid observation," he said, before pivoting seamlessly. "But we've negotiated a strategic concession in exchange. The early disbursement ensures priority allocation of materials. We can't afford delays." Heads nodded again. I felt the pattern crystallizing. My input was acknowledged, then reframed as cautious friction. Daniel didn't silence me. He absorbed me. He translated my concerns into something less urgent, less decisive. Afterward, one of the project managers stopped by my desk. "You're always so careful," he said with a half smile. "Good thing Daniel balances that out." Balances, as if prudence required correction. I laughed softly because that's what you do when someone compliments your restraint while undermining your authority. It's just process, I replied. But internally, something tightened. Over the next few months, small dismissals accumulated like fine dust. I'd ask for documentation. Someone would sigh theatrically. I'd recommend waiting for regulatory clarification. Daniel would reassure the room that it was within acceptable exposure. I'd flag inconsistencies. He'd promised to circle back later. Later rarely came, and yet I rationalized everything. I told myself this was corporate hierarchy functioning normally. Directors assume calculated risk. Analysts manage parameters. My job wasn't to obstruct, it was to inform. So I informed, and I watched my language evolve. Instead of, "This raises compliance concerns," I began writing, "This may require future reconciliation." Instead of, "This structure is irregular," I wrote, "This structure deviates from prior patterns." I softened my edges because sharper words didn't change outcomes. The truth is, I had been trained long before Whitaker and Rowe to equate silence with maturity. Growing up, speaking up too strongly meant being labeled dramatic. Being too assertive meant difficulty. So I mastered neutrality. At work, neutrality translated into safety. But safety is a subtle trap, because every time Daniel dismissed a concern without review and nothing immediate happened, it reinforced the perception that I worried unnecessarily. I even began to question myself. Maybe this is just how high-level structuring works. Maybe I'm too rigid. Maybe I lack the vision to see the broader strategy. That's how normalization happens. Not through overt humiliation, but through repetition. Through the steady erosion of your internal calibration. Then came a quarterly compliance review with external auditors. Routine. Predictable. I prepared the documentation binder as usual. During the session, one of the auditors paused at a subcontractor entry. "This advisory firm," she said casually. "New entity?" "Yes," I answered. "Incorporated recently." She nodded but made no further comment. Daniel leaned back in his chair, relaxed. Afterward, in the hallway, he placed a light hand on my shoulder, a gesture so brief it might have looked collegial to anyone watching. "You worry too much, Summer," he said softly. "Trust the bigger picture." Trust. It sounded almost kind, but trust, I realized, had become directional. I was expected to trust upward. My professional judgment, however meticulous, was not trusted in return. That night, I stayed later than usual, not because I had to, but because I felt something unsettled beneath the surface of routine. I reopened archived files, comparing early project structures to newer ones. Patterns were emerging. Not illegal, not yet provable, but deliberate. And for the first time, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting. Instead, I asked a different question. If I'm not wrong, why does everyone benefit from me believing I am? There's a moment, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you realize you've been cast in a role you never auditioned for. For me, it happened during a leadership offsite in early spring. We rented a glass-walled conference space overlooking Lake Union. The executives sat around a polished oval table with catered lunch arranged neatly behind them. I was there to support documentation, which meant I wasn't technically part of the strategic discussion, but I was expected to capture it. Daniel led most of the session. He stood at the front, sleeves rolled precisely to the same height on both arms, presenting an ambitious expansion into 2 additional counties. Fast-tracked permits, consolidated subcontracting, streamlined payment flows. Streamlined. I noticed the word appearing more often. At one point, a board member asked, "Is compliance comfortable with the acceleration?" Daniel didn't look at me. He answered for me. "Summers reviewed the framework," he said smoothly. "We're within operational tolerance." Within operational tolerance. It was accurate, technically, but it omitted context. It omitted the caveats I had written in internal memos. It omitted the documentation gaps I was still tracking. I felt every pair of eyes glance toward me briefly, not to invite input, but to confirm compliance. I gave a small nod. Not because I fully agreed, but because contradicting him in that moment would have reframed me as an obstructionist. And obstructionists are quietly sidelined. That was when I understood the role I had been assigned. I was the stabilizer, the quiet validator, the one whose presence implied oversight, even when oversight was being maneuvered around. Daniel didn't need to silence me outright. He needed me adjacent enough to legitimize momentum. Reliable, useful, invisible. After the offsite, a colleague joked in the elevator, "You're basically Daniel's insurance policy." I smiled politely. Insurance policies are only noticed when something goes wrong. Back at my desk, I reviewed the expansion plan again. The structural changes were subtle but consistent. Intermediary consulting entities, layered disbursement schedules, accelerated approvals routed through channels that technically complied, but only under generous interpretations. Each component alone looked defensible. Together, they formed a design. I began to see how my role functioned inside that design. If anyone questioned the speed or structure, Daniel could reference the compliance review. My name, attached to reports, served as assurance. And because I rarely challenged him publicly, the perception of alignment held. What unsettled me wasn't that he made aggressive decisions, it was that he curated proximity to my credibility while dismissing my caution. That realization didn't ignite anger. It produced clarity. I thought back to my early days at the firm. How grateful I'd been for responsibility. How determined I was to prove competence. I had equated being needed with being valued. But being needed in the background is different from being respected in the foreground. The following weeks reinforced the pattern. Daniel began forwarding fewer draft documents before finalization. When I asked for earlier access to review evolving contracts, he responded lightly, "Don't worry, I'll loop you in when it's ready for compliance polish." Polish. As if my expertise were aesthetic rather than structural. I adjusted again. Externally compliant, internally observant. I started creating parallel folders for my own reference. Timestamp snapshots before revisions. Archived email threads before edits. Not out of rebellion, out of preservation. Because once you understand the role others expect you to play, you face a choice. Perform it blindly or redefine it quietly. I wasn't ready to confront him. I wasn't even ready to accuse. But I was no longer naive about my position in the architecture of his decisions. They believed I would continue absorbing risk silently. They believed my steadiness meant passivity. They believed that because I didn't raise my voice, I didn't see the full picture. And perhaps most dangerously, they believed I would always stay in the role they had assigned me. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen because of a sharp comment or a public dismissal. It happened on a Tuesday night, long after most of the office lights had gone dark. I wasn't supposed to be there that late. Officially, I had finished my quarterly review summaries and sent them to Daniel for inclusion in the board packet. But something about the numbers, small discrepancies across 3 separate projects, had been echoing in my mind all afternoon. Not large discrepancies, rounded ones. There's a difference. Large anomalies trigger alarms, rounded ones suggest intention. I reopened the payment logs for the Tacoma project, then cross-referenced them with 2 newer developments. Advisory firms appeared again, different names this time, but similar incorporation timelines, similar routing patterns, similar percentage allocations. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the spreadsheet, the glow of my monitor, the only real light left on the floor. It wasn't chaos. It was choreography. Each transaction alone could be defended as strategic structuring, but together, over time, they created a steady siphon, small, precise, almost elegant. Money moved from primary contracts into secondary entities, then into layered holding structures that would require deliberate effort to untangle. No one had made. My chest didn't tighten. My pulse didn't spike. Instead, I felt something colder. Recognition. Daniel wasn't reckless. He was careful, which meant the dismissals weren't casual confidence. They were calculated containment. He didn't ignore my concerns because they lacked merit. He neutralized them because he understood their potential. I scrolled further back in the archives, comparing early year projects to the current fiscal cycle. The pattern began subtly, almost experimentally. Then it grew more confident. That was when the realization landed, not as fear, but as quiet certainty. If external auditors ever decided to trace these layers fully, compliance would be implicated by proximity. My reports, my summaries. My name is attached to review confirmations, even if I had flagged concerns internally, even if my language had been cautious. Perception is powerful, and perception would not parse nuance kindly. I closed my eyes for a moment, listening to the faint hum of the building's ventilation system. The office felt different at night, less performative, more honest. I thought about Daniel's hand briefly resting on my shoulder weeks earlier. Trust the bigger picture. I thought about the board member asking if compliance was comfortable. I thought about the way my nod had sealed something. That was the moment the shift occurred. Not from loyalty to betrayal, from assumption to agency. I had believed that if something crossed a clear legal boundary, I would act. But Daniel had structured everything just inside the margins, inside the gray. He relied on ambiguity as insulation. And ambiguity thrives when no one consolidates the full pattern. I opened a new folder on my encrypted external drive, the slim silver one I kept in my bag but rarely used for work. I labeled it simply Archive. I didn't copy anything yet. I just created the space. Because the shift wasn't about exposure. It was about preparation. For the first time, I stopped thinking of myself as a passive witness to executive decisions. I began thinking like someone who might one day need evidence, not to attack, not to humiliate, but to protect truth from being rewritten. I shut down my computer close to midnight. As I walked through the empty corridor toward the elevator, the city lights reflected faintly against the glass walls. No one knew anything had changed. Daniel would arrive the next morning with the same composed authority. Meetings would proceed, contracts would move, and I would still be Summer, the steady one. But internally, something fundamental had recalibrated. I was no longer documenting because it was my job. I was documenting because I understood the stakes. And once you see the full pattern, you can't unsee it. After that Tuesday night, I didn't confront Daniel. I didn't draft a warning email. I didn't request a private meeting. I didn't even change my tone in the next review session. On the surface, nothing about me shifted. But internally, silence stopped being reflexive. It became deliberate. There's a difference between staying quiet because you doubt yourself and staying quiet because you're observing. In the weeks that followed, Daniel moved faster. 2 new advisory entities appeared in separate project files. The structuring grew slightly more sophisticated, longer paper trails, more layered justification. I watched the architecture refine itself, and I adjusted my behavior in ways so small no one noticed. I stopped offering verbal cautions in meetings unless directly asked. Instead, I embedded clarifying language into written summaries. Precise phrasing, timestamp notes, controlled documentation. If Daniel chose to override my written observations, that decision now lives clearly in the record. He seemed almost relieved by my restraint. "You're efficient lately," he remarked one afternoon, glancing over a report. "No friction." I nodded lightly. "Just streamlined." The word hung between us for half a second longer than necessary. He smiled, not catching the shift in meaning. Silence is powerful when the other person believes it confirms alignment. Inside the department, my reputation solidified further. Colleagues described me as low drama, stable, supportive. When managers needed someone to process high-volume documentation without complaint, they came to me. I accepted everything calmly. What they mistook for compliance was calculation. I began mapping relationships between entities on my own time, not at home, not recklessly, but during long evenings when the office emptied and the rhythm of activity slowed. I traced formation dates, compared director names across filings, noted shared addresses masked through registered agents. Nothing illegal on its face, but the probability of coincidence narrowed. The most unsettling part wasn't the pattern itself. It was Daniel's confidence. He operated as if the system would never look too closely, as if everyone involved benefited too much from momentum to pause for scrutiny, as if I, quiet, steady Summer, would never be the variable he needed to account for. That realization didn't inflate my ego. It clarified my position. I wasn't powerless, I was underestimated. And underestimation creates blind spots. One evening, during a late review session, Daniel stopped by my desk. The office lights were dimmed to half power. "You don't have to stay this late," he said casually. "I trust you." Trust. Again, directional. I met his eyes, calm and neutral. "I prefer finishing what I start." He gave a small approving nod and walked away. What he didn't understand was that finishing what I started no longer meant finalizing documents for presentation. It meant completing my understanding. Silence, when chosen consciously, becomes space. Space to observe without interference. Space to prepare without suspicion. Space to decide without pressure. I wasn't ready to act, not because I was afraid, but because incomplete action would be reckless. If I moved too soon, the pattern could be dismissed as misinterpretation. If I confronted without consolidation, I would be isolated. So I waited. And while I waited, I built clarity. Daniel believed my quiet meant loyalty. The team believed my restraint meant agreement. They were wrong on both counts. My silence was no longer surrender. It was a strategy. And strategy, when practiced patiently, often looks like weakness, until the moment it doesn't. Preparation doesn't look dramatic. It looks like routine. That was my advantage. By this point, staying late had become normal for me. No one questioned it. "Summer's still here?" the cleaning staff would ask gently as they passed my desk. I'd smile and nod, headphones in, spreadsheets open. They assumed dedication. They never considered documentation. I began with structure. Instead of reacting to individual projects, I built a master index, privately. A timeline of advisory firms, incorporation dates, linked addresses, and recurring signatories. I didn't speculate, I cataloged. I created columns for documented justification, board visibility, override instances, and transaction routing. Patterns strengthened when placed side by side. 3 advisory firms shared formation agents, 2 listed directors who rotated across entities under slightly altered name formats. Payment percentages hovered consistently within a narrow band, large enough to accumulate, small enough to evade scrutiny. I never removed original files from company systems. I copied what I was already authorized to access: contracts, amendments, internal memos, approval chains. Time-stamped emails where I had raised procedural concerns and received executive overrides. Each file exported cleanly, named systematically, stored on my encrypted external drive. The slim silver one inside the navy leather pouch. I didn't rush. Speed invites error, and error invites discovery. Instead, I worked in layers. First, historical documentation. Second, transaction confirmations. Third, cross-referenced public filings. Fourth, board presentation summaries where advisory costs were aggregated into broader categories. What struck me most wasn't greed. It was patience. Daniel hadn't executed a single reckless extraction. He had built a channel, one that required trust and routine, trust that no one would consolidate data across fiscal cycles, trust that compliance, represented by me, would remain fragmented in perspective. He underestimated consolidation. I also began learning quietly outside the office. Regulatory whistleblower protections, legal definitions of fiduciary breach, thresholds for criminal liability versus ethical misconduct. I wasn't searching for drama, I was mapping consequences. If this ever surfaced, it needed to be precise. Emotion weakens credibility, documentation strengthens it. There were moments late at night when doubt surfaced. What if I was misinterpreting aggressive but legal structuring? What if Daniel had private agreements I wasn't privy to? So I stress-tested my own conclusions. I looked for disconfirming evidence, alternative explanations. I ran hypothetical justifications through compliance guidelines. In every scenario, one truth remained consistent. These advisory entities offered minimal operational value relative to their compensation. Value misalignment is rarely accidental. One Friday evening, as rain pressed softly against the glass windows, I reviewed a newly signed subcontract. Another advisory layer had been added, this time tied to a different region. The incorporation date was less than 6 weeks prior. Confidence had grown. I copied the entire project folder, not impulsively, methodically. That was the night the archive shifted from precaution to safeguard. I wasn't collecting leverage to threaten. I was preserving truth before it could be revised. What they never noticed was how my demeanor remained unchanged. I still brought organized binders to meetings. I still summarized regulatory updates concisely. I still smiled politely when Daniel reframed my language. They saw consistency. They didn't see accumulation. Preparation is quiet by nature. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't announce itself. It waits. And the more I prepared, the calmer I became. Because fear thrives in uncertainty. Clarity dissolves it. By the end of that quarter, I understood the structure better than anyone else in the building. Daniel thought he was the architect. He didn't realize I had drafted the blueprint of his architecture, line by line, transaction by transaction, and I had stored it somewhere he could not edit. The revelation didn't arrive with a dramatic discovery. It arrived with arithmetic. One Saturday afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open and my external drive connected. Rain tapped softly against the window. Seattle's steady background rhythm. I wasn't looking for a smoking gun. I was calculating accumulation. Individually, each advisory disbursement felt minor relative to the total project budgets, 1.5% here, 2% there. Occasionally 3, but never enough to trigger instinctive alarm. But when I aggregated them across 12 projects, across 2 fiscal years, across 4 separate advisory entities, the number no longer felt minor. It felt deliberate. 7 figures. Not explosive theft, not reckless siphoning, controlled extraction. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the total. My reaction wasn't shock. It was stillness. The kind that settles when suspicion becomes confirmation. Daniel hadn't created chaos. He had engineered a leak, small enough to avoid noise, consistent enough to compound, complex enough to discourage casual tracing. I reopened the entity filings I had cross-referenced weeks earlier. This time, I looked deeper into director relationships. A name surfaced, subtly linked through a secondary holding structure to a trust registered in Wyoming. The trustee's surname matched Daniel's mother's maiden name. It wasn't conclusive proof of ownership, but it wasn't a coincidence either. I didn't feel anger. I felt clarity sharpen. This was no longer about procedural disagreement or aggressive strategy. This was a sustained channel of personal benefit disguised as operational structuring. And the most unsettling realization wasn't the money. It was the insulation. Daniel had ensured plausible deniability at every layer. No document explicitly tied him to the advisory firms. No payment was moved directly into his personal accounts. The structure relied on fragmentation, on the assumption that no single observer would assemble the full mosaic. Except I had. The weight of that understanding settled slowly. I walked to my kitchen sink, filled a glass of water, and stood there for a long moment. Outside, cars moved through wet streets, unaware of quiet revelations happening behind apartment windows. This was the private reveal. Not a confrontation, not a confession, just me alone, recognizing the full architecture. I returned to my laptop and reviewed my archive folder. Contracts, emails, transaction confirmations, timeline indexes. I had more than suspicion. I had pattern documentation. I had executive overrides captured in writing. I had evidence that compliance concerns had been raised and dismissed. But evidence is not the same as exposure. Exposure is irreversible. Irreversible actions require a decision. I closed the laptop and placed the external drive back into its navy pouch. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the personal risk. If this surfaced publicly, compliance would be scrutinized, my reports would be dissected, my cautionary language would be examined for adequacy. Had I done enough? The answer quietly was yes. I had documented, I had flagged, I had preserved. The question was no longer about truth. It was about timing. Daniel believed he controlled the narrative because he controlled momentum. He trusted that no one inside the system would disrupt the flow. He never accounted for the possibility that a patient would outlast his confidence. There was no triumph in the discovery, only a steady awareness that the leverage now existed. And leverage, when held calmly, does not need to be displayed. It only needs to be positioned. That night, I slept deeply for the first time in weeks, not because the situation was resolved, but because uncertainty had been replaced with knowledge. I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I knew exactly what it meant. Once you see the full picture, you don't immediately act. You evaluate. For several days after the private reveal, I moved through the office as usual. I attended meetings. I summarized reports. I responded to emails with my typical measured tone. Internally, though, I was mapping outcomes. There were multiple paths available to me. I could confront Daniel privately, present the pattern calmly, and give him a chance to explain. But confrontation without protection would be naive. If he denied everything and accelerated document restructuring, I would lose the advantage of timing. I could escalate internally to the board's audit committee. Anonymous submission, structured briefing, but boards are complex ecosystems. Loyalty, reputation, and financial incentives, these factors blur clean reactions. If mishandled, the matter could be buried quietly, and I would be identified as the source. I could resign, walk away, keep my archive as personal insurance, let external forces eventually uncover the architecture. That option felt safe and incomplete. Because resignation would not protect the integrity of the record, it would only protect me. The final option was the most deliberate and the most irreversible. Formal disclosure through regulated external channels. Not dramatic exposure, not media, not spectacle. Regulatory audit. Whistleblower protections exist for a reason. They are structured, procedural, slow, but thorough. If I submitted documentation properly, the investigation would move independently of internal politics. It would follow transactions, not personalities. But once that process began, there would be no retracting it. The firm would be examined, projects paused, reputations questioned. Even if I remained anonymous initially, scrutiny would tighten around departments with access to consolidated data, which meant me. I took a long walk one evening along the waterfront, letting cold air sharpen my thoughts. I wasn't motivated by revenge. I wasn't even motivated by moral outrage. I was motivated by alignment. My name was attached to compliance oversight. If this structure continued and later imploded, proximity alone could damage my credibility permanently. Silence would not protect me indefinitely. And beyond self-protection, there was something simpler. Truth, if left undocumented in the right place, becomes negotiable. Daniel had relied on the negotiation of narrative, on confidence, on speed, on the assumption that no one would choose the difficult channel. He underestimated my tolerance for patience. I returned home and reviewed federal reporting procedures again. I verified submission requirements, evidence thresholds, confidentiality parameters. I cross-checked timelines to ensure documentation completeness. Then I created a second encrypted backup of my archive. Redundancy protects integrity. The next morning at work, Daniel stopped by my desk. "We're presenting expansion metrics next quarter," he said. "Strong growth. You'll prepare the compliance summary." I looked up at him, steady. "Of course." He walked away satisfied. He believed the trajectory was upward. That afternoon, I drafted a structured evidence summary. Not emotional, not accusatory. Just factual sequencing. Entity formation timelines. Transaction routing patterns. Executive override documentation. I didn't exaggerate. I didn't speculate. I documented. Submitting the report would initiate a chain of events I could not control. But control had never truly belonged to me. Clarity had. And clarity now required action. Late that night, alone in the office once again, I connected the silver external drive to my computer. The building was silent. The decision had already been made. I uploaded the files through the secure regulatory portal, methodically, section by section. Confirmation receipts are saved immediately. When the final document was transmitted, there was no surge of adrenaline, only stillness. Irreversible does not always feel explosive. Sometimes it feels precise. I shut down my computer, placed the external drive back into its pouch, and turned off my desk lamp. The architecture Daniel built would now be examined by professionals trained to follow patterns. He would not know when the first inquiry began. He would not know who consolidated the data. But the momentum he trusted so completely had just shifted direction, quietly, permanently. After the submission, the hardest part was restraint. There's a misconception that once you take decisive action, you feel urgency to see results. That wasn't true for me. If anything, I became even more controlled. Regulatory processes don't move loudly. They move deliberately. And so did I. The morning after I uploaded the files, I arrived at the office at 8:15 a.m., the same time I always did. I placed my tote under my desk. I reviewed overnight emails. I prepared the weekly compliance digest for distribution. Nothing in my tone changed. No urgency, no tension. Daniel walked past my desk around 9:30. "Morning, Summer." "Good morning." He paused briefly. "We may need an expedited review on the Pierce County subcontract. I'll send it over." "Send it when ready," I replied. He nodded, satisfied. That was the strangest part, how normal everything felt. He operated from the assumption that momentum was still his ally. The board continued discussing expansion targets. Project managers continued negotiating supplier timelines. But somewhere beyond the building, outside the ecosystem he curated, documentation had begun circulating through independent channels. I didn't check the portal obsessively. That would have fed anxiety. Instead, I shifted into preservation mode. I reviewed my own past reports again, ensuring clarity. I organized my internal email folders in case future requests required quick retrieval. I avoided unnecessary commentary in meetings. Every sentence I spoke was intentional. Silence now wasn't just a strategy. It was protection. 2 weeks passed before the first subtle ripple appeared. An external audit firm, one not previously associated with our routine reviews, requested access to transaction-level data for 3 specific projects. The request came formally through executive administration. Daniel forwarded it to me with a short message. "Routine variance check. Please compile." Routine. I read the attached scope carefully. The projects listed were the earliest ones in my archive timeline. The pattern had been detected. I compiled the requested files meticulously, complete, unaltered, timestamped. I did not withhold. I did not editorialize. I attached my original internal memos where applicable, including the cautious language I had used at the time. When Daniel stopped by later that afternoon, there was the faintest crease between his brows. "Interesting timing," he said lightly. "Audit scope seems thorough." "Thorough is good," I answered. He studied me for half a second longer than usual. Then he nodded. "They won't find anything material." Material. I returned to my screen without responding. Because materiality depends on perspective. Over the next few days, additional document requests followed. Advisory firms, consulting agreements, payment authorization chains. The scope expanded gradually, never dramatically, but consistently. Inside the office, most employees remained unaware. Audits were part of business life. Only those directly handling financial routing noticed the increased granularity. Daniel's tone in meetings sharpened slightly, not aggressive, just more precise. He asked for summaries twice, clarifications 3 times. He began requesting earlier drafts of compliance reports again. He was recalibrating, but he still did not suspect the source, because he still believed silence equaled loyalty, and I gave him nothing to contradict that belief. Each evening, I returned home, placed the silver drive in its usual drawer, and allowed myself a single steady breath. The machinery was in motion now, not fueled by emotion, but by documentation. No one had been confronted, no accusations had been made, no scenes had unfolded, and yet the architecture was being measured. Momentum, once his greatest asset, had shifted into examination, quietly, systematically, and there was nothing he could rush past anymore. Consequences don't always arrive as explosions. Sometimes they begin with hesitation. About a month after the first audit request, the atmosphere inside Whitaker and Rowe changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable, at least to me. Project approvals slowed. Not publicly, not announced, just paused. Email threads that once closed within hours now linger. Payment authorizations sat in draft folders a little longer than usual. Daniel, who had always prided himself on velocity, began asking more questions before final sign-off. In meetings, I noticed a shift in the board's tone, less celebratory, more inquisitive. "Can we revisit the advisory allocations?" one member asked during a quarterly review. Daniel responded smoothly, as always. Standard structuring, industry norm. But this time someone followed up. "Let's document the comparative benchmarks." Comparative benchmarks. That wasn't the language Daniel typically used. I kept my expression neutral as I typed notes. Inside, I recognized the pattern of escalation. Auditors had likely requested additional context from the board. Questions were beginning to travel upward. The ripple widened. A week later, finance requested clarification on 3 advisory firms, specifically their service deliverables relative to compensation. The request came through formal channels, copied to multiple executives. Daniel forwarded it to me with a short message. "Please prepare a summary justification." Justification. The word felt heavier than before. I compiled what existed: contracts, scopes of work, and invoices. The documentation looked thin when placed side by side. Vague deliverables, broad strategic language, limited measurable output. I didn't add commentary. I didn't need to. The absence of substance was visible. Daniel stopped by my office that evening, later than usual. The floor was quieter than normal. "You've noticed the increased scrutiny," he said casually, leaning against my doorframe. "Yes." He studied my face, perhaps searching for anxiety. "It's procedural," he continued. "Growth triggers attention." "Of course," I replied. He nodded slowly. For the first time since I'd known him, there was a trace of calculation in his gaze, not toward the board, not toward the auditors, toward the room, toward proximity. But he still didn't see me as a threat. He saw me as infrastructure. Over the following weeks, consequences accumulated without clarity. A pending expansion into Snohomish County was delayed pending review. A supplier renegotiated payment terms after receiving audit inquiries. One advisory firm quietly dissolved its registration. Dissolved. That detail caught my attention immediately. It wasn't dramatic. No announcement. Just a status update in a public registry. Someone was repositioning. Inside the office, frustration surfaced among mid-level managers. "Why are we suddenly bogged down?" one asked in a team call. "We've never had this level of interference." Interference. Daniel remained composed. "These cycles happen," he assured them. "Stay focused." But I could see it now. The slight tightening around his jaw when audit emails arrived. The way he rereads summaries is more carefully. The increased attention to compliance phrasing. He was adjusting, but he didn't know where the adjustment needed to begin. And that uncertainty is destabilizing for people who rely on control. One afternoon, I overheard 2 finance analysts whispering near the printer. Apparently, regulators are looking deeper than usual. Into what? No idea. Something about advisory routing? Advisory routing. The phrase felt almost clinical. No one mentioned corruption. No one mentioned misconduct. Just routing. Consequences often start in language before they manifest in action. Budgets tightened slightly. External counsel appeared in calendar invites. And Daniel, for the first time, began requesting one-on-one check-ins with department leads. When he scheduled one with me, I accepted without hesitation. The architecture was under examination now, not collapsing, not yet, but measured. And measurement changes behavior. They didn't know why things felt different. They just knew something had shifted. I knew exactly what it was. Momentum had met resistance. And resistance, once institutionalized, is difficult to outrun. Daniel's one-on-one with me was scheduled for 4:30 p.m. on a Thursday. By then, the atmosphere inside the firm had grown noticeably tighter. Conversations lowered when executives walked by. Calendar invites from external counsel became more frequent. The board had called for a comprehensive structural review. Still no accusations, just language that signaled distance from certainty. Daniel closed my office door gently behind him. He didn't sit immediately. He stood for a moment as if choosing his tone. "You've seen the audit scope expanding," he began. "Yes." They're interpreting routine structuring as something more layered than it is. Layered. An interesting choice of words. He finally took the chair across from me. His posture remained composed, but the effortless confidence I'd grown used to had thinned slightly. "I need to understand," he continued, "whether anything in your reports could be misread." Misread. The question wasn't about accuracy, it was about exposure. "My reports reflect documented structures and noted variances," I replied evenly. "They're consistent with the files submitted." He held my gaze. "Did you ever feel," he asked carefully, "that we moved outside acceptable boundaries?" There it was. Not an admission, not a confession, a calibration attempt. "I documented when boundaries were approached," I said. "Executive decisions followed." Silence filled the space between us. He nodded slowly, absorbing the phrasing. It wasn't confrontational, it wasn't defensive. It was factual. Over the next week, the consequences accelerated. Regulators requested direct interviews with finance leadership. Advisory firms were formally subpoenaed for service verification. One board member publicly recused himself from expansion oversight pending clarity. The narrative inside the firm began to fracture. Daniel called an emergency executive session. The language shifted from routine review to unexpected depth of inquiry. Outside counsel advised halting several disbursements temporarily. Halting. Momentum had stopped. In the hallway outside the boardroom, I passed Daniel speaking quietly into his phone. "No, there's no internal whistleblower," he said firmly. "This is likely an algorithmic pattern detection." Algorithmic. He was searching for a faceless trigger, not a person. By then, it was too late to fix structurally. One advisory entity had already dissolved. Another had attempted to retroactively amend service descriptions. But digital trails don't erase easily. Timestamped filings, payment authorizations, executive approvals, they form a chronology resistant to revision. Panic inside corporate spaces rarely looks chaotic. It looks procedural. Emergency documentation requests, legal memos circulated at midnight, controlled statements drafted in anticipation of inquiries. But control was no longer centralized. The board initiated an independent internal investigation separate from Daniel's oversight. His access to certain financial systems was temporarily restricted, framed as standard practice during review. Standard practice. He understood what that meant. On Monday morning, an all-hands email announced that Daniel would be stepping back from active leadership responsibilities pending structural evaluation. Stepping back, no accusation, no admission. But everyone felt the shift. In the break room, employees speculated in hushed tones. "It's probably nothing. Maybe accounting discrepancies. He'll be back in a week." I poured my tea quietly, listening without engaging. Later that afternoon, security escorted external investigators to Daniel's office. Not dramatically, not forcefully, just formally. Too late to restructure, too late to dissolve, too late to redirect. The architecture he built had been measured end to end, and measurement leaves very little room for narrative control. When Daniel's office lights remained off that evening, the building felt different, not victorious, just recalibrated. Momentum had reversed, and nothing inside that system could rewind it now. Daniel requested to see me 3 days after he officially stepped back. The meeting wasn't in his office. That space was sealed pending review. Instead, we met in a small, neutral conference room on the 12th floor, one usually reserved for vendor calls. The blinds were half drawn, late afternoon light filtered through in muted stripes. He looked composed, not polished in the same effortless way as before, but controlled. His tie was slightly loosened. His eyes are sharper, more analytical. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Of course." We sat across from each other at the narrow table. No coffee, no notepads, no assistants waiting outside. Just quiet. "They're tracing advisory structures across fiscal cycles," he began. "Someone consolidated data that was never meant to be viewed that way." There was no accusation in his tone, just observation. "I imagine that's what auditors do," I replied calmly. His eyes held mine a second longer than usual. "You were always thorough," he said, "more than most." I didn't respond. He leaned back slightly. "Did you ever believe I was acting recklessly?" The question was measured, almost reflective. "I believe the structures carried long-term exposure risk," I said. "I documented that." He exhaled softly, not frustration, not anger. Recognition. "For what it's worth," he continued, "I never intended for you to be implicated." Implication. That word lingered. "Intent doesn't alter proximity," I said quietly. He studied me carefully then. In that moment, I sensed the shift fully. He wasn't speaking to the compliant analyst he had once directed. He was recalculating, reviewing past interactions in light of present reality. "You stayed silent," he said. "Yes. Why?" The question carried no hostility, just curiosity. "Because silence allowed clarity," I answered, "and clarity required patience." There was a long pause. For the first time since I'd known him, Daniel didn't seem to be searching for the right, persuasive phrasing. He simply nodded. "They'll ask you questions," he said finally. "I'll answer them truthfully." "I assumed you would." There was no confrontation in the dramatic sense, no raised voices, no confession, no blame. Just two professionals acknowledging the architecture of consequence. As I stood to leave, he added quietly, "You were underestimated." It wasn't admiration. It wasn't resentment. It was an acknowledgement. I paused at the door. "Yes," I said, "I was Siwa." And then I left. The hallway outside felt unusually bright. There was no triumph in my chest, no satisfaction, just equilibrium. The confrontation had not been about exposing him. It had been about revealing alignment. He had relied on my steadiness as infrastructure. I had relied on my steadiness as a strategy. And in the end, the same trait he interpreted as compliance had become the variable he never accounted for. No heat, no spectacle, no revenge. Just truth, positioned carefully enough that it no longer required my voice to defend it. It's been 11 months since that meeting on the 12th floor. Daniel resigned officially 2 weeks after our conversation. The public statement cited strategic misalignment and procedural oversight failures. Legal language, neutral tone, no dramatic headlines. The investigation concluded quietly but decisively. Several advisory structures were deemed improper under fiduciary standards. Financial restitution agreements were negotiated. The firm restructured its oversight protocols. No one used the word corruption in internal memos, but everyone understood what had happened. I was interviewed 3 times during the review process. Each session was clinical. They asked about documentation timelines, override communications, and escalation thresholds. I answered calmly, providing records when requested. No one accused me of negligence. My reports, carefully worded, time-stamped, consistent, became part of the official narrative of due diligence. After the investigation closed, the board offered me an expanded role. Director of Compliance Architecture. Architecture. The word felt intentional. I accepted, not because it felt like victory, but because it felt aligned. My job now isn't to support momentum blindly. It's to design systems that prevent momentum from bypassing integrity. Oversight channels are clearer. Advisory structures require independent valuation. Executive overrides trigger automatic secondary review. Nothing revolutionary, just resistant to ambiguity. What surprises me most isn't the title change. It's how differently I move through rooms now. I speak less, but when I do, people listen fully. Not because my voice is louder, but because my presence carries documented weight. I no longer soften language to preserve comfort. I state exposure plainly without aggression. And when someone attempts to reframe caution as friction, I hold eye contact until the room recalibrates. There is no bitterness in me. Daniel was not a cartoon villain. He was intelligent, strategic, confident in his insulation. He believed he could manage risk indefinitely. He miscalculated one variable: underestimation. I don't hate him. In a strange way, I'm grateful for the architecture he built because it forced me to redefine my own. For years, I believed being calm meant staying small. I believed being agreeable meant being safe. I believed that if something was truly wrong, someone louder would correct it. I was wrong about that. Quiet does not equal weak. Silence is not surrender. Observation is not passivity. The difference lies in intention. Today, when I walk past the same glass-walled conference rooms overlooking Lake Union, I don't feel invisible. I feel grounded, not because I expose someone, but because I refuse to let my integrity be negotiated. My silver external drive still sits in the drawer of my desk at home. I haven't needed it since the investigation concluded. I keep it anyway, not as a weapon, as a reminder that the most powerful shifts in life rarely happen through confrontation. They happen when you decide that your quiet will no longer be careless. I am still steady, but now steadiness is unmistakably mine. When people ask me now how I knew what to do, I tell them something simple. I didn't act because I was brave. I acted because I was clear. Clarity doesn't arrive all at once. It builds slowly, through small dismissals, subtle patterns, quiet observations that refuse to disappear. Most of us ignore those signals at first. We rationalize them. We tell ourselves we're overthinking. We tell ourselves it's not our place. I told myself all of those things. But there comes a point when silence stops protecting peace and starts protecting distortion. That was the line for me. What changed my life wasn't exposure. It wasn't Daniel stepping back. It wasn't the promotion or the new title. It was the moment I realized that being underestimated is not a disadvantage unless you internalize it. When people assume you won't act, they reveal their blind spots. When they assume you don't see the full picture, they stop guarding their edges. Underestimation creates space. And space, when used carefully, becomes leverage. This story was never about revenge. I didn't want him humiliated. I didn't want spectacles. I didn't want applause. I wanted alignment. I wanted my name attached only to structures I could stand behind without hesitation. I wanted documentation to reflect truth, not narrative convenience. And perhaps most importantly, I wanted to prove to myself that quiet does not mean powerless. We talk a lot about speaking up loudly, about confrontation, about dramatic turning points. But sometimes the strongest form of dominance is discipline. Staying calm when dismissed, preparing when ignored, acting without announcement. If you've ever been the one in the room people overlook, the one taking notes while others make decisions, I want you to remember this. You are closer to the truth than they realize. The question isn't whether you're capable. The question is whether you're willing to use your clarity when the moment demands it. So I'll leave you with this. Have you ever been underestimated in a way that later became your greatest advantage? I'd genuinely like to hear your story in the comments.